Imagine this. For centuries, the sacred texts of the Bible have been the foundation of Western civilization. Considered the Word of God, they tell the story of creation, the flood, and the first humans. But what if I told you that these stories didn't appear out of nowhere, that their roots lead back to pagan myths written thousands of years before the Bible in one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity, Babylon? In this video, we'll reveal a shocking truth that many historians and theologians prefer to ignore. We'll travel back in time to understand how one of the world's most important books was shaped by the stories of ancient Mesopotamian cultures. Get ready to see the Bible in a completely new light. This is the story of how ancient Babylonian myths became the foundation of sacred scriptures. We've all heard about the creation of the world in 7 days, the first humans, Adam and Eve, the great flood that destroyed humanity, and the Tower of Babel that scattered the nations. These stories, collected in the first chapters of the book of Genesis, are deeply ingrained in our culture. But scholars have long noticed that they have striking parallels with stories found on thousands of clay tablets buried under the sands of Mesopotamia. We're not talking about a few similarities, but identical literary genres and plot lines. Why is this so important? Because the biblical accounts of creation and the flood belong to the same literary genre as the Mesopotamian myths of creation and the flood. This is the first key fact. Second, the stories themselves are almost identical. Let's take a closer look. Creation in Genesis 1 begins with watery chaos. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. The Mesopotamian creation myth, called the Enuma Elish, also begins with watery chaos. But here the water is personified in gods, Apsu, the god of fresh waters, and Tiamat, the goddess of salt waters. When the god Marduk defeats Tiamat, he cuts her in two to create the heavens and the earth. Sounds familiar, right? In Genesis 1, God also divides the waters from the waters to create the firmament. In both stories, light exists before the creation of the sun, moon, and stars. In both, dry land is created, followed by the heavenly bodies, and finally by man. One of the most striking discoveries is that Berosus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in the 3rd century BCE, describes creation using these very same elements from the Enuma Elish. He translated these Babylonian myths into Greek, a language that was widely spoken among educated Jews at the time. This is the key. The Enuma Elish was a sectarian and local myth linked to the cult of the god Marduk in the city of Babylon. Why did this specific myth, and not one of the dozens of other Mesopotamian creation stories, appear in the Bible? The answer, according to some scholars, is because Berosus made this particular account accessible. He created a single, unified source of Babylonian history in Greek, a language that the Jewish intellectuals of the time mastered. This is the key. The Enuma Elish was a sectarian and local myth linked to the cult of the god Marduk in the city of Babylon. Why did this specific myth, and not one of the dozens of other Mesopotamian creation stories, appear in the Bible? The answer, according to some scholars, is because Berosus made this particular account accessible. He created a single, unified source of Babylonian history in Greek, a language that the Jewish intellectuals of the time mastered. The story of the flood in Genesis is one of the most famous accounts. God decides to destroy humanity because of its corruption, but he chooses the righteous Noah to build an ark to save himself, his family, and a pair of every living creature. But hundreds of years earlier, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of Utnapishtim. He also receives a warning from a god about an impending flood that will destroy all of humanity. He also builds a massive boat, takes a pair of every animal on board, and saves his family. Of course, there are differences. In the Mesopotamian account, there are many gods. They quarrel among themselves and are even afraid of the flood they caused. But the core plot elements are identical. Here again, the name Berosus appears. He also describes the flood story, borrowing it from ancient Mesopotamian sources. And here, as with creation, Berosus's influence is so strong that his version of the flood is closer to the biblical one than to the original Babylonian texts. This raises serious questions. In Genesis, before the flood, 10 long-lived patriarchs are mentioned who lived for hundreds of years, from Adam to Noah. This idea is also not unique to the Bible. The Sumerian king list enumerates 10 kings who ruled before the flood, with their reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Just as in the Bible, after the flood, kings begin to live much shorter lives. This cannot be a mere coincidence. What about the story of the Tower of Babel? In Genesis 11, humanity decides to build a tower with its top in the heavens so they wouldn't be scattered. God, seeing this, decides to confuse their language and thus scatters them across the whole earth. This story was most likely inspired by the Babylonian ziggurats, massive temple towers that did, in fact, reach the heavens, at least in people's minds. For a long time, the dominant theory for the origin of Genesis was the documentary hypothesis. According to it, the first chapters of the Bible were composed from various sources written between the 9th and 5th centuries BCE, and the Mesopotamian influences entered Jewish oral traditions much earlier, around 1400 BCE. But this model has serious flaws. First, there is no evidence that Mesopotamian myths were widespread in Canaan at that time. Second, there are no traces of Canaanite myths in Genesis 1-11, even though Canaanite culture had a strong influence on other parts of the Hebrew Bible. Third, the model requires accepting a complex transmission of oral traditions over centuries, for which there is no external evidence. Here comes the new model. Instead of an early indirect influence, it proposes a direct influence from a single source, Berosus's Babyloniaca, published around 278 BCE. This model solves many problems. The authors of Genesis only needed to have access to one book. Berosus's book was in Greek, a language that educated Jews understood. This aligns perfectly with the period when the language of the Bible, the Greek translation Septuagint, was being created, 273 to 269 BCE. In other words, the authors of the early chapters of Genesis likely did not borrow directly from ancient cuneiform tablets, but from a contemporary source, Berosus's book, which was accessible and in a language they understood. This discovery doesn't take anything away from the spiritual value of the Bible. On the contrary, it gives us a new, deeper perspective on how our sacred texts were formed. It shows us that the Bible is not just a book that fell from the sky, but a document that is a product of its time and place. It was in dialogue with the surrounding cultures, using their stories to convey its unique messages and theological views. The answer to the question, which came first, the Bible or the Babylonian myths, is clear. The Babylonian stories are older, but this does not make the Bible less significant. On the contrary, it shows us how a group of people, the Jews, took these widely known myths and reworked them to create a monotheistic narrative about a single God. This is the story of how sacred texts were shaped by the history of the world.
Now, I want to delve into the depths of the book of Genesis. We're all familiar with the first words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. This is one of the most cited and sacred passages in all of history. For decades, academia has been certain of one thing, that the creation account in Genesis, especially in the first chapter, shows strong influences from Mesopotamian sources. The main suspect is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that describes how the chief god Marduk defeats the primordial goddess Tiamat, personifying the ocean, and from her body creates the heavens and the earth. Just as in Genesis, in the Enuma Elish, creation begins with primordial waters. In the Enuma Elish, these waters are personified as the deities Apsu, the fresh waters, and Tiamat, the salt waters. In both accounts, there is a division of the waters. In Genesis, God separates the waters from the waters to create the firmament. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk slays Tiamat and cuts her body in half to create the heavens and the earth, thereby separating the waters above him from the waters below him. In both accounts, the creation of dry land follows, then the heavenly bodies, and finally man. But be careful, there is one significant difference. While Genesis 1:2 explicitly states that darkness was over the surface of the deep, the original text of the Enuma Elish contains no mention of primordial darkness. It speaks only of the primordial waters. This difference is so significant that scholars like Schnabel and those who follow him believe that any mention of darkness in other sources similar to the Enuma Elish must be a late Judeo-Christian interpolation, i.e., an addition made to correspond with the Bible. In the 3rd century BCE, the Babylonian priest Berosus wrote a monumental book called Babyloniaca. He based it on ancient cuneiform tablets and translated the history of Babylon from creation to the conquest by Alexander the Great into the Greek language. Why is this so important? Because at that time, Greek was the common language of science and culture, spoken and understood by educated people throughout the Near East, including the Jewish intelligentsia. When Berosus describes creation, he does something that was not done in the Enuma Elish. He says that the primordial universe consisted of nothing but darkness and water. That's right, he uses the same words we see in Genesis 1:2. How is this possible? Here we have 3 options. Option 1. Berosus borrowed from Genesis. This is unlikely, as the Bible was not yet so widely circulated, and Berosus was basing his work on Babylonian sources. Option 2. Someone later changed Berosus's text to match Genesis. This is the standard academic explanation. Option 3. The authors of Genesis borrowed directly from Berosus. This is the new, increasingly popular hypothesis that explains a lot of things. Berosus was a priest of the god Bel-Marduk. He had access to the royal and temple libraries of Babylon. For him, the Enuma Elish was the most important text on creation. So it is perfectly logical for him to translate it and include it in his book. But why did he add the darkness? The answer lies in his unique allegorical interpretation. Berosus claims that the battle between the god Bel, Marduk, and the goddess Omorka, Tiamat, was an allegorical explanation for the creation of the world. While the Enuma Elish simply describes a battle between deities, Berosus transforms it into a cosmological battle between light and darkness. He explains that Tiamat, whose name he translates as sea, Thalassa, was the personification of primordial watery chaos. But he also calls her Selena, the moon, and Omorka, whose numerical value matches that of the moon. This connection does not exist in the Enuma Elish. It is unique to Berosus. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk is described as a sun god. In Berosus's account, Bel-Marduk is the one who cuts through the darkness, separates the heavens from the earth, and establishes order in the universe. Berosus goes on to say that the monsters created by Tiamat could not endure the light and were destroyed. This detail about the destruction of monsters by unbearable light is also missing from the Enuma Elish, but it is perfectly logical if Marduk is light and Tiamat is darkness. So, Berosus did not just retell the Babylonian myths. He interpreted them as an allegory for the victory of light over darkness. This is a deeply theological concept that perfectly matches the account in Genesis, where God separates the light from the darkness and establishes order out of chaos. This is a much more powerful parallel than simply borrowing a flood story. In Genesis 2:7, it says that God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. The idea that man is a breathing creature is central to this narrative. We find something similar in Berosus's account, but not in the Enuma Elish. Berosus describes how Bel-Marduk, after defeating Tiamat, created new people and animals that could breathe the air. He makes a clear contrast between these new creatures and the original monsters that inhabited Tiamat's watery realm. This concept is also not directly borrowed from the Enuma Elish, but is cleverly derived from it. In the Enuma Elish, Tiamat's death is caused by Marduk filling her with the 7 winds. Thus, her death is linked to the introduction of air into her watery realm. Berosus transforms this detail into a metaphor for the creation of a new world inhabited by creatures that breathe air, not water. Again, we see how Berosus takes an element from the Babylonian myth and reworks it into a more complex and philosophical concept that is strikingly similar to the one in Genesis. Previous academic theories required us to believe in many things. That the Enuma Elish, a local and sectarian Babylonian myth, traveled to Canaan around 1400 BCE, was preserved in oral traditions for hundreds of years, and was then independently incorporated by different authors of the Bible who added details like darkness and breathing air.
Let's continue with the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. According to the first 2 chapters of Genesis, the created state of humanity was one of absolute delight. It was a paradise. Man and then woman were placed at the very pinnacle of the created order, the climax of God's work. The text tells us they were given dominion. They were the rulers of this perfect world. This was not a world of struggle. It was not a place of survival. It was a realm of harmony. Man's very purpose was to tend to this garden, to be its guardian and its king. The animals were not his prey. They were his companions. In Genesis 2:18-20, this is clear, as the animals are brought to Adam as a potential helper suitable for him, even if none of them was ultimately a perfect match. This was a world of coexistence, not a world of hierarchy based on predation. In this pristine state, humanity was deeply connected to the natural world. They ate the herbs of the field, just like the other animals. There was no need for agriculture, for complex tools, or for a struggle to extract food from the ground. Food was simply provided. There was no terror, no fear, no enemies. This was a state of flawless peace. Perhaps most tellingly, humanity was naked. Genesis 2:25 explicitly states, "The man and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame." This nakedness was not a symbol of vulnerability or poverty. It was a symbol of absolute innocence, of a lack of self-awareness, and a complete absence of fear or judgment. There was no need for clothes because there was nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. This then is the biblical picture of humanity's original state, a blissful, natural paradise where humans were kings of creation, living in harmony with all living things and completely innocent. This is a state that, for the authors of Genesis, was perfect and desirable in every way. This is the starting point, the foundation upon which the biblical authors would build their powerful argument. But now, let's travel across the desert to the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, the very cradle of civilization. Here, a different story was told. Sumerian creation stories also describe a primitive, original state of humanity, a state that in many ways sounds identical to that in Genesis. In these stories, primitive humans were also naked. They also lived much like animals, eating grass from the fields. There were no snakes or other natural enemies, and there was no reason for fear. These stories also mention the lack of the attributes of civilization. There were not yet irrigation canals, agriculture, herds to provide wool for clothing, and kings to build cities and temples. So far, the parallels are striking, but here is where the stories diverge and where the essence of the ancient debate begins. For the Mesopotamians, this primitive natural state was not paradise, far from it. It was viewed as a completely miserable way of life. This was a state of being that was pathetic and pitiable, something to be escaped from, not celebrated. These primitive people were stuck in a brutal, animalistic existence that was devoid of the comforts, culture, or order that defined a truly human life. So, what was the solution? According to the Mesopotamian understanding, the gods themselves, specifically the deities Ninmar and Enki, took pity on these miserable primitive humans. They did not see humanity's struggle as a test or a consequence. They saw it as a problem to be solved. And they solved it by bestowing upon humanity the arts of civilization. The gods gave them the knowledge of agriculture, how to dig canals, and how to build cities. They sent them a king with a divine scepter, and thus the first cities were founded, with Eridu being the most famous among them. In this worldview, civilization was not something to be wary of. It was a divine blessing, a gift from the gods that elevated humanity from its pathetic, animalistic existence and allowed it to flourish. The creation of cities, the development of agriculture, the establishment of kings and culture, all of these were reasons for joy, symbols of human progress and enlightenment. This is the Mesopotamian worldview, a story of evolution from misery to prosperity, of a progressive march toward a better life thanks to the generosity and wisdom of the gods. Now we can begin to see the true genius of the Genesis account. The authors of Genesis were not simply retelling a borrowed story. They were engaging in a systematic polemic, a point-by-point rebuttal, a head-on refutation of the Mesopotamian worldview. They took a story that everyone knew and reversed its meaning, its moral, and its outcome. Let's examine this polemic. First, the status of humanity's original state. For the Mesopotamians, the primitive, natural state was miserable and pathetic. For Genesis, it was paradise. The life of innocence, the life as an animal, was not a state to be escaped from, but a state to be celebrated. It was a time of perfection. Second, the role of knowledge. For the Mesopotamians, knowledge of the arts of civilization was a blessing, a gift from the gods that brought joy and progress. For Genesis, it was a curse. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was precisely what caused humanity's downfall. Knowledge in this context was not a step forward, but a fall from a state of grace. It led to shame, self-awareness, and the loss of innocence. The very things the Sumerians celebrated as progress, the biblical authors condemned as sin. Third, agriculture and labor. In Mesopotamian stories, agriculture was a divine gift that liberated humanity from its miserable grass-eating existence. For Genesis, agriculture becomes a curse, a consequence of sin. After the fall, God tells Adam, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life." Genesis 3:17. Hard labor, thorns and thistles, the struggle to make the earth yield food. This was not a gift, but a punishment. Fourth, the rise of kings and cities. The Mesopotamian accounts present kings and cities as a divine good, a mark of civilization bestowed upon a pathetic humanity. The first city, Eridu, was a symbol of divine favor. Genesis, however, presents a radically different view. In Genesis, primitive man was already a king. He was given dominion over all creation. The need for earthly kings and earthly cities was not a sign of progress, but a sign of a fallen state. Strikingly, the biblical text attributes the advancements in the arts of civilization, the forging of bronze and iron tools, the playing of musical instruments, and the building of cities, to the unrighteous line of Cain, Genesis 4:20-22. The first city mentioned in Genesis, Enoch, has a name strikingly similar to the first Mesopotamian city, Eridu, but it is founded by the wicked line of humanity, not the righteous. This is no coincidence. It is a powerful, systematic rejection of the Mesopotamian ideal. Fifth, population growth. This is one of the most compelling contrasts. In Genesis, humanity is given a divine command: be fruitful and multiply, Genesis 1:28. A growing population is a blessing, a sign of God's favor and humanity's success. In the Mesopotamian accounts, especially in the Epic of Atrahasis, it is the exact opposite. The growing population of humanity and the unbearable noise it created kept the gods awake, which led them to send the devastating flood to destroy humanity. For them, overpopulation was a curse, the very reason for humanity's near total destruction.
Therefore, the biblical text is not simply an echo of Mesopotamian tales. It is a calculated, complex, and brilliant reversal of their core values. It takes everything the Mesopotamians considered good and calls it evil, and everything they considered pitiable and calls it good. Now, one crucial question remains. How did the authors of Genesis acquire such a deep understanding of these ancient, often obscure, Sumerian and Akkadian stories? The standard academic explanation, the documentary hypothesis, suggests that these myths were incorporated into Jewish oral traditions sometime between the 15th and 9th centuries BCE. But this theory has serious flaws. For one, there is no evidence that the Sumerian flood story, or its account of primitive people, was widely circulated in the region of southern Syria in its original form. And more importantly, the theory requires a remarkable feat of oral tradition, preserving and transmitting these very specific stories for many centuries, a process for which there is no external evidence. So, what does all of this mean? Does it diminish the biblical story? Absolutely not. Instead, it elevates it. Understanding the Garden of Eden as a polemic reveals the extraordinary sophistication of its authors. They were not writing in a vacuum. They were active participants in a vibrant intellectual and theological world. They took the dominant ideas of their time, ideas that lauded civilization, knowledge, and human progress as gifts from the gods, and offered a radical, new, and deeply monotheistic alternative. The biblical authors were making a bold theological statement. They were arguing that true paradise is not found in human progress, in the acquisition of knowledge, or in the building of great cities. Instead, true paradise is a state of simple innocence, of harmony with God, and of a life lived in accordance with His divine will. Civilization, knowledge, and the kings who rule it are not the source of human prosperity. They are a consequence of the fall, a sign of humanity's brokenness. Genesis 1 through 11 is not just a collection of ancient myths. It is a brilliant, foundational document of a new religion that uses the very myths of its rivals to establish a new, powerful, and enduring worldview.
The biblical authors were not copying, they were criticizing, reinterpreting, and transforming. Therefore, the Garden of Eden is not just a story about a lost paradise. It is a story about a theological battle won, a battle that laid the foundation for a new understanding of God, humanity, and the very meaning of civilization. Discovering these connections changes everything about how we read and understand the Bible. It shows us that these stories are not isolated pieces of history, but are part of a continuous, living dialogue that has stretched across millennia. They were created to challenge, to provoke thought, and to offer a new vision for what it means to be human. If you enjoyed this new perspective on the Garden of Eden, subscribe to our channel to continue uncovering these historical mysteries with us.